It's the fact that we're getting used to something which should be utterly shocking.
The wildfires are terrifying, and I think considering these a new normal shouldn't be the case. It's not normal. It's so far from normal.
We're just bombarded with climate denial, climate delay, any effort to basically let the fossil fuel industry off the hook.
Net zero has been heavily politicised now, and we could be seeing the next election fought over the words net zero.
It's a quite deliberate attempt to rip down all the progress we've made on trying to deal with this vast existential threat.
These are really vital issues. They're about the existential future of our planet, of our kids and their kids. Why can't we do it? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Matt Frei. From southern Europe to Spain and Italy and Scotland, huge wildfires are tearing across Europe. Thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes. Firefighters are battling blazes around the clock. And forecasters are warning that more extreme heat is still to come. Scientists have long predicted that climate change would make events like these more frequent and more severe. Now they're no longer warnings about the future. They are the reality that we are all living through. So if this is what a warming world looks like, what life at 40, you could argue, looks like, why is the political response so limited? Has the climate crisis slipped down the list of priorities? And are any of us really prepared for the changes needed to avoid even greater disasters? To discuss all this, I'm joined now by the climate activist and author George Monbiot, Liz Bentley, the chief executive of the Royal Meteorological Society, and Fiona Macklin, head of climate at Apolitical, a global networking platform for public servants and policymakers. Welcome to you all. Let me start with you, Liz, if I may. It's been really bad. We've seen the pictures from France and Spain, but also from Scotland. But it was also bad a few years ago. Is it worse, or is this just the new normal that we have to get used to and then we forget about, in the winter and autumn months?
Yeah, so things are getting worse. The wildfire season is starting earlier. It's lasting longer. The area, the coverage is greater as well. And we're seeing this being played out year after year now. We've had wildfires for decades, but the season was a lot shorter and more confined. And not only are they wildfires, they're actually now penetrating into suburban areas. And we've seen that being played out over the last few days.
So the threat, Liz, of, a city like Bordeaux, which was once, I think, voted the most livable city in Europe, to be evacuated, an entire city or large parts of a city, 300,000 people on the move. That is something we've not heard before.
Yeah, that's right. And, Valencia is another place that's already experiencing the wildfires as well at the moment. And if you remember back only a short while ago, Valencia was struggling with floods. So it's getting two extremes, too much rain and then obviously too little leading to the wildfires as well.
George, you've been covering the climate for as long as I can remember, and, but also looking at the political aspects of it. How come you think that the most trenchant thing that we can experience, which is to have, a forest or your home burnt down or flooded, something we can all, get our head around. How come that doesn't create the political alarm and response amongst the voters, let alone the politicians, that you might expect?
Well, interestingly, it generally does among the voters, and voters are much more tuned into this than most of our representatives are, and indeed than most of the media is. And let's remember, the media is 50% of any problem. When it comes to climate breakdown, I'd say it's 70 to 80% of the problem.
Why do you say that, by the way?
Well, because we're just bombarded with climate denial, climate delay, any effort to basically let the fossil fuel industry off the hook. And most of the media is owned by billionaires or corporations, and billionaires and corporations are almost, without exception, the large ones, invested in fossil fuels or fossil fuel related activities. They don't want business as usual to change. And so they use whatever tactics they can to prevent that change from happening. And so the climate link is perennially downplayed. We hear reports of the fires, we hear reports of the heat waves, and very few of those reports directly and overtly link it to climate breakdown, even though attribution science is very clear on this issue. But we also see extraordinary things like the Times a couple of days ago in the midst of the fires in France and Spain saying net zero threatens our security. What greater threat to security can there be than large areas of the planet becoming uninhabitable, major threats to our food security as a result of the enormous impact of drying and other weather disasters, and of course all the political effects of people being driven from their homes and life becoming less and less bearable.
Fiona, looking at you, I can't tell whether you're agreeing with George or not. What is it?
Look, I think, first of all, the wildfires are terrifying. And I think considering these a new normal shouldn't be the case. It's not normal. It's so far from normal. And I do agree with George that I think the majority of the population really feels that way. I think the issue is that often they are not vocalising that fear as much as they should do. And to George's point, then the narrative is skewed in the media, and often the majority of articles that are coming out in online news is negative against net zero, which is not reflective of the general population's perspective on climate and the need for governments to do more. But what I would also say is that I think the political response has actually been impressive. I do think we need to balance these two realities that we're seeing. I think in many instances, governments are introducing policies that in the last decade have seen forecasts for solar capacity be exceeded by 1,600%. We're seeing solar power in energy supply overtaking coal. So actually we are doing a lot, and we shouldn't forget that. Of course, the impacts of severe weather are going to be hitting us hard, and that will continue to be the case despite very strong political will, even if that's introduced from now on. So I think it's really important to not forget that the positive response that is being generated in many parts of the world.
But are we doing a lot? I mean, a very influential climate activist put out a thing the other day on social media outlining 45 different areas in which governments, in the EU, obviously in the United States, but also in the UK and elsewhere, have actually done the exact opposite. Not only are they not acting fast enough, they've introduced legislation going in the opposite direction.
Look, I think what we're also not seeing is on the flip side of that, the positive policies that are being introduced. And I think you could list the same number, if not more, of those that are making a difference, whether that is example of Colombia and the Netherlands hosting a historic international conference on the phase out of fossil fuels last year, with 57 nations now mapping out practical transition strategies.
Liz, I mean, the science has been very, clear for the vast majority of scientists, and also I think for the public that's interested for a very long time. Are you frustrated as a scientist that the politics seems to be all over the shop on this?
Well, I think Fiona mentioned it. I mean, there's definitely been some positive step forwards in the UK and in other countries around the world in that kind of step to net zero. I think the frustration is that net zero has been heavily politicised now, and we could be seeing the next election fought over the words net zero, which would be a real shame. And two camps of people who want to push forward with net zero and then others that don't. And that's really the challenge here, isn't it? We, as you say, the science is very clear. We know what the problem is. We also know what a lot of the solutions are. We've been delivering those here in the UK and elsewhere, but it's the pace of action, I think, that is too slow. And as you say, some policy decisions that are going in the opposite direction as well. That's really the frustration.
I mean, I struggle to find another area of legislation where the science is so clear, the physical impact of things going wrong is very clear as well, and yet the politics moves in lots of different directions. How do you as a scientist explain that?
Yeah, it's really challenging. And I guess it comes down to money, doesn't it? All of these things, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, are going to cost money. And there are other priorities that, governments have at the moment. The big discussion, I guess, in the UK is the cost of living crisis, and a lot of initiatives and policies that have been brought in this last week or so are really focusing on supporting people through that cost of living crisis. And so it's balancing these priorities. And so the Climate Change Committee brought out a report quite recently, their climate change risk assessment, and that looks at adaptation. So we know our climate is changing, and we know we have to now become more resilient to this changing climate. And there's a cost to do that. And they've estimated those costs at about £11 billion a year. But they've also said that if we do inaction around adaptation, the cost will be much, much greater to the UK. So it's got, it is seen very much as an investment for the future, but that's the challenge. We need to find that money when there is little money money, I guess, within the kind of purse strings of government, and there are other priorities fighting against that.
I mean, we often see the relationship or the alternative between the cost of money you spend on climate change, and what households will have to spend to adapt, et cetera, insulation. But what we're not looking at is, or doing nothing. But what we're not looking at enough, I think, is the money that can be made from climate change, the money that's in the green economy. There is money to be made there, George, is there not? And why are we missing that point?
The Confederation of British Industry points out that it's already worth £100 billion in this country, and it's just growing and growing with extraordinary speed. In fact, the renewable sector is now a much bigger employer than oil and gas is. Oil and gas is on a downward trajectory, whichever way you look at it, and renewables are on an upward trajectory. So, and in fairness, the government has been emphasising this, and we saw when Ed Miliband was Energy Secretary that some really quite exciting things were happening. But to respond to Fiona's earlier point, they're really good at doing the positive stuff. They're much less good at doing what you could call the negative stuff. And to beat climate breakdown, it's not just about the good things that you install and initiate, it's about the bad things you shut down. That's absolutely crucial. Otherwise, it's like saying, well, I don't understand. I ate 2 salads on top of that tub of ice cream and that cake that I had today, but I'm still not losing weight. You have to shut down the ice cream and the tub of ice cream and the cake, and eat the salads instead. But at the moment, the danger is that we still have everything. We still have fossil fuels, we still have renewables, we still have a livestock industry, which is a huge threat to the living planet, both in terms of its direct effects, the methane it produces, and the indirect effects, the habitat destruction it causes, releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And none of these things are being properly addressed. At the same time, while the government's quite good at what could be considered the distal policies, in other words, the things that are remote from our lives, changing our electricity supply. It doesn't matter to us where the electricity is coming from. If the lights come on when you turn the switch, it's really much less good at engaging with things which require our involvement, like changes of diet, like changes in the way we travel, for example. And it's made almost no progress at all on those.
Fiona, has the government, and not just this government, but other governments, been really bad at putting out incentives, financial incentives for us to live greener lives, be kinder to our planet, burn less fossil fuel, and, either get financial incentives or, other things that people might appreciate, other than just thinking that we are doing something that is good, which should in itself be enough, but isn't, obviously.
No, look, I think I don't agree with that. I think the government has, and as has been set out, I think we've seen fantastic growth in really good jobs that are involved in the clean economy. That economy now supports 1.1 million jobs in this country. And on average, they're paid 11% higher. I think that's worth highlighting. And it's generating, as you said, George, over 100 billion in gross value add. So that, I think, is incentive enough as a national authority. I'd also look down to the more local level. I think local leaders in different communities and different constituencies around the country, across the political spectrum, are really engaging their communities, whether that is in establishing national heritage projects in Cambridgeshire, whether it's a heat plan response in London or low traffic neighbourhoods in Wiltshire. We're really seeing a breadth of sort of stronger engagement with local people and actually a really sort of generative conversation across the country that, of course, can continue to strengthen and needs to in response to what we're seeing. But I think it comes back to the point that we were discussing earlier around that conversation, that engagement, that public support is being drowned out by a smaller minority in the media, which is not reflective of the national conversation or the national state of play. I think in other countries around the world, look at Spain, and obviously they're facing this dramatic wildfire, but we're seeing a national emergency being declared and really rallying support behind that decision in the government. So I think we need to sort of be cautious, and I think we're all doing so in this conversation of really questioning what is an easy narrative and an easy criticism to point, and actually uplifting the positive progress and engagement that is being set about.
But even the Green Party, the Green Party talks more about social issues and social inequality, and traditional, labor issues than it does about green issues now, which I find astonishing. George?
Well, I think it does at the moment, and it's true because it's kind of trying to establish itself in those other areas. It's a shame, in my view. I want to see that laser focus on the greatest existential threat we face, which I think it does describe the environmental and climate crisis. That there is an attempt by everyone to sort of almost normalize the situation we're in and to say, well, we can adapt, we can find ways around it. Whereas, as we've already found with the heat waves in this country and across Europe, many people can't adapt. Many people have failed to adapt. Many people have died as a result. And, we urgently need better adaptation, is absolutely true. But at the same time, we need to stop this crisis and to stop it as effectively as possible. And one of the things which is lacking here, and I think Fiona sort of alluded to it, is this sense of emergency. We've had Parliament declare a climate emergency, but there's been no action on that basis. We haven't even had any emergency briefings. Now, during the first wave of the COVID pandemic here in the UK, we had a series of government briefings with the Prime Minister and the chief health officers standing behind podiums saying, this is what we're facing, this is what we need to do. Why can't we see that with climate? We need to mobilize people. And for that to happen, you need government to articulate the problem and explain why people should be stepping up. Because up till that point, it's just people like us here in this discussion who are urging people to get engaged. And wonderful, as I'm sure we all are, we don't have that authority. We don't have the authority that only the government has.
Liz, would you like to stand next to Prime Minister Andy Burnham on the podium to do exactly what George has just described? Would that make a difference?
Absolutely. And I think that's really important. We've got to get the urgency of this problem out to the public. And, there's the stories that we see when we get these wildfires and these heat events, and you get the reports of the number of deaths after these heat waves, it sits and it resonates with people. And as we said earlier in the discussion, about 4 out of 5 people in the UK, are interested, concerned, and want to do something about climate change. But it's that not knowing what to do. And so it's not just about kind of giving them the information about the starkness of the problem, but actually giving them information about what they can do as individuals or within their communities, or to support the kind of government in leading on kind of national change.
Liz, it's so interesting that George just mentioned the example of COVID. We were prepared to lock ourselves in our homes, to basically stop doing what we have been doing, whether it's schooling or work or leisure, all of it. We became hermits for quite a few months, if not longer, on the basis of a warning issued by the government. But we were prepared to do that for something like that virus. And yet, there's a hosepipe ban. We're seeing yellow fields everywhere. We're feeling the drought. We're feeling the heat. We can't sleep. We're watching these wildfires with horror. You would have thought the impact of what's going on right now should be much greater. And yet people aren't responding in the same way. Is it because we just get used to stuff all the time? That's the tragedy. Is it because COVID has slightly spoiled and lockdown has spoiled it for us in terms of a collective response? What's going on there? There seems to be a psychological disconnect.
So I think for me, it's personalising this. So we're very used to throwing big numbers around. In COVID was the same, the number of people infected and the number of deaths. But if you personalise this, we start to see the impact that it has on say, your grandma or grandparents, on your children now, not just in the future, but now. And I think that was very much how COVID worked, because people stayed at home because they wanted to protect themselves and their loved ones. And I think we can make that personalised connection with climate change. So instead of just the number of deaths, these are people, these are real people that have died or have been impacted significantly because of the extreme heat that we've had in the UK and seen elsewhere in recent weeks. It's personalising those stories rather than just the numbers, I think, that would be really important here.
And of course, thousands of people have died. And I think I think back in France, what was it, 2004, was the hottest summer in France, on record perhaps until now, something like 28,000 people died. I mean, these are COVID numbers of casualties, and yet they died mostly quietly. There were elderly people who expired at home, and their bodies were discovered a bit later. I mean, George, again, it's the fact that we're getting used to something which should be utterly shocking. Or maybe there are, we're getting used to it, but actually my kids, for instance, are deeply troubled by all this, much more arguably than I am. So it's a generational thing, maybe.
Well, partly. I mean, I think also it's that there wasn't a sort of pro-virus lobby in the same way that there's a pro-fossil fuel lobby. We can't discuss this in the absence of the forces who just want to keep things running the way they are, however disastrous the consequences. And the fossil fuel lobby is perhaps the most powerful on earth. It's massively funded, huge profits from the oil industry, and some of those profits are ploughed into political persuasion, and it's very effective, and it does nix effective action. I think we should be aware of what governments can do when they want to. And the standout example, of course, is the US after Pearl Harbor, where it turned the whole economy round in about 3 months. It turned a civilian economy into a military economy. It mobilized pretty well the whole population to one degree or another. It retooled everything, the factories, the production lines, the whole lot was just changed towards this one objective of defeating the Axis powers. And we saw similar things in pretty well all the participants in the war. And this remarkable transformative effect that government can have when it devotes itself to the task and it says to people, this is of overriding importance. Free riders will not be tolerated. Everybody's in this together and we mean it. And you're going to help us to defeat this great evil. Well, that's what we need with climate breakdown. And if we had that, it could happen so quickly. We could see this massive turnaround in economic life, in political life, in social life.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but it's easier to point the finger at the Nazis or Adolf Hitler. He's a very clearly defined enemy than it is to point it at yourself for driving a diesel truck, or I don't know, using, burning too many coal fires or whatever. I mean, maybe that's the problem. We're asking to declare war on our way of life in order to mobilize the kind of change that you require. And that's just not happened yet. It may never happen.
Well, George Orwell said that the lady in the Rolls-Royce car does greater damage to national morale than a fleet of Goering's bomber planes. So, the target was actually remarkably similar. Unless you are pulling together, unless you're abandoning your luxurious lifestyle, unless you are adhering to the rationing regime and all the other things.
Liz, I just want to I keep coming back to the psychology of all this, but I think it's so fascinating. Why is it that we aren't able to mobilize people in the way that, we did, Americans did after Pearl Harbor, we did at the same time, roughly the same time a few years earlier. These are really vital issues. They're about the existential future of our planet, of our kids and their kids. Why can't we do it?
Well, I mean, we talked about this earlier, the role the media plays as well. And I was alongside some climate scientists who wrote to the heads of all the news channels in the UK not so long ago, just a few weeks ago, asking them to really step up here, because there are many times we report extreme weather events and there's no mention of climate change. There's no mention of the need to reduce our fossil fuel.
Is that self-censorship? Sorry to interrupt. Is that self-censorship? People thinking that if they call it out for what it is, they might get hammered by I don't know, someone on the right who says you're missing the point here, you're trying to peddle your agenda. How is it that this scientific thing has been so politically coloured for such a long time?
And that's the problem, isn't it? Is politicised. And I also would say, if you speak to science journalists, they probably do connect the dots because they understand where, what's caused an extreme weather event and will tell that whole story. Whereas I guess a factual news journalist would just state the facts. We've got a wildfire maybe taking place here and maybe not connect and link to climate change. And then the public really don't see the full extent that the climate change crisis is playing out in our every day-to-day lives. So I think there's a real role here in how we communicate every event that, has the fingerprints of climate change, and we make it clear to the public the link to climate change. And as George mentioned, there are attribution studies there that are doing this all the time in real time. So we can do that. We've got the science to back this up. And then also to solutionize, because I think that's really part of it here. It's not just, we have an extreme problem, but what we as people, as communities and as nations can do to resolve it. So it leaves people feeling more empowered, because otherwise people it's too big a problem. I can't do anything personally, therefore I'm just going to ignore it, or, they become totally anxious about the whole problem. And that doesn't solve the problem for anybody. So it's that need to support people to make the right decisions. And we've talked about numerous things people can do during this interview. So, we know what the solutions are. As I say, it's just that action that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually, this sort of sense of hopelessness about collective change. I mean, getting back to the COVID example, we all knew what we could do, or what we thought we could do to protect ourselves from the virus, which is to stay at home and wear a mask, for instance, and then get a jab. But, we all have to do something that down the line changes the climate in which we live, or under which we live. And that's a much trickier connection to make, isn't it? There are so many steps removed from what we do and what finally results. And that's the problem. So how do we message that more effectively, George?
So I think one thing to say to people is, look, despair is actually irrational, because we don't know what's coming next. You can come up with all sorts of reasons why we should just succumb to doom. But actually, when you look at the incredible transformations which previous political movements have effected, whether it's the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the independence movements, there are many around the world. For all of them, it looked as if they were confronting an unscalable wall. It was just impossible. And I think society is a complex system with two equilibrium states. One is called impossible and the other is called inevitable. And from the perspective of anything you want to achieve, it's always impossible. And then suddenly it happens and everyone said, well, that was inevitable, wasn't it? And if you look at the way that countries have turned around so fast, if you look at Ireland, for instance, until the 1980s was basically a Catholic theocracy whose strength was only growing. And then suddenly the whole thing falls apart and it becomes this sort of liberal, open, egalitarian nation built on completely different secular principles. It was a number of events, the scandals which emerged about the church, activists finding their voice, international travel showing how different things could be. And suddenly this great edifice just goes boom into the dust. Same with Berlin Wall coming down. There's so many good examples like this. And so, don't despair, because things could flip very quickly from the impossible equilibrium state to the inevitable state.
And Fiona, it's often said that those who advocate climate change and want us to work towards net zero, that they're being too political. But actually, looking at this as a completely neutral observer, the real political testosterone is on the side of the drill baby drill lobby. It's on the side of Trump. They're the ones who've turned the whole thing into a political crusade heading in the opposite direction from the beginning. And it's now beginning to define their politics as much as, anti-immigration policies and so on. So if you are in favor of, doing something about climate change, about changing the way that society lives and works in order to prevent the disasters from getting worse, isn't it time for those people to get far more political?
I would argue that actually we keep saying that this narrative is politicized. I think the main problem with it is that it is silenced. And actually there is underneath the hood a more cross-party consensus on this issue than we want to believe.
Really? Reform UK, the Greens and Labour and the Tories all agreeing with each other? I don't think so.
But I think if you explore more deeply and in a more nuanced way, there is much more agreement and much stronger agreement than we want to believe. 89% want intensified political action. 69% of our population are willing to give 1% of their income. It's just that they don't believe that their neighbours do as well. And I think it's that pluralistic ignorance that is actually preventing us from more work.
I beg to differ, but I'll let George do that if he wants to. I mean, do you agree with Fiona on this? Or?
Well, I mean, she's right in one respect. She's absolutely right about where the people are, but where the political forces are, the political parties, I mean, they are poles apart, and deliberately so. You know, I mean, both Reform in this country and the Republican Party in the US and other parties like them have been, as you say, Matt, rolling that agenda rightwards further and further and further at the behest of the fossil fuel industry. Trump was absolutely clear about this. He said, give me £1 billion in campaign contributions and I'll deliver the country to you. And it's a quite deliberate attempt to rip down all the progress we've made on trying to deal with this vast existential threat. And the idea that these political forces could ever be reconciled, I mean, that's just a pipe dream. That's never going to happen. They have to be beaten.
Right. So is the problem that actually some politicians, some activists, you're one of them, I guess, some scientists, maybe you're one of them, Liz, they appeal to people's better sense, to their piety, you know, to the logic of science. And actually, what if you want to increase, if you want your agenda to actually happen, what you need to do is take off the gloves and become brutally political about it. Find people who are making tons of money, you know, out of climate change, get them on your side just as much as Trump's got the oil companies on his side, knowing in the back of your mind that what you're doing is ultimately better for the planet. But just get brutal about it, Liz.
Well, maybe so. And as you say, I think the strong voice, the evidence of the science isn't enough, is it? I mean, clearly we're seeing that. We've known what the problem is. We've had clear science of how our climate is changing and will continue to change for decades. And yet, you know, and we talked earlier, there has been some shift, there has been some movement, but the big problem at the moment is the whole politicisation, particularly around net zero. And that, as I say, I think the next election could well be fought over that.
Okay, so finally, we're going to wrap it up. I just want to go to each of you and ask you, I've been told to ask you all to be hopeful at the end, right? We like to end these podcasts on on a note of hope. But let me rephrase it slightly. Do you think at the end of the day, and I think you all agree on where you want to head. You want to go towards a world of net zero. I want to know from you whether it takes a massive disaster, even worse than what we've seen at the moment, to really galvanize change, or whether ultimately, bit by bit, in this incremental way, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, we will get there. First, you, Fiona.
I don't think we can afford to wait for a big disaster, and I think we're already facing plenty. So I think it is going to have to take significant ratchets in a very short space of time. And I think we are already seeing them. We need to get behind them. We need to amplify them much more. And we need to really support the leaders who know what we need to do and are facing them. And I think that is happening and needs to happen more.
So there's positive stuff that needs to be nurtured and encouraged as opposed to the opposite. Okay. George, what about you?
The answer to your question is neither. Neither a big disaster will do it. And in fact, people sometimes respond to disasters in quite perverse and reactive ways, nor incremental change. The plural of incremental change is not systemic change. The plural of incremental change is failure. We need systemic change. That has to be led by government. We need a highly ambitious government strategy which people can get behind, and then things could change very quickly.
Are you seeing it from this government here right now, Andy Burnham, a week in office?
I'm not seeing it yet, but then, give them time. I'm not writing the guy off.
Okay. Liz, you're the scientist in all this. I mean, the clock is ticking, isn't it? Big time.
Oh, absolutely. And, as I say, the science is very clear, and that has to be the positive here. In a sense, we know what the problem is and we know how to solve it. And the frustration, as I mentioned earlier, is the pace of action is far too slow, and you can just see things running away. But you have to be hopeful because, as I say, we know the problem, we know what the solution is. We just need to get on with it.
I can't tell you how many podcasts on the climate I've ended with those very words, but uttered by someone else. And then we're here again 6 months later. Thank you very much to all of you. Liz Bentley, Fiona, Macklin, George Monbiot. It's been a pleasure. It's been interesting. I hope it's enlivened and enlightened people out there. This is the Forecast. Thank you very much.